For as long as I've been playing video games, few developers have made as strong an impression on me in such a short amount of time as the folks over at Falcom. I was first introduced to Falcom's games back in the summer of 2019 when a good friend of mine introduced me to their Legend of Heroes Trails series. It didn't take long for me to fall in love with that series, and a little less than a year later, I was caught up to the first 8 games and was patiently waiting for the Western release of Trails of Cold Steel 4. As I made my way through the Trails series, I had the idea to try out Falcom's other modern flagship series in Ys. And by the end of summer 2020, I had caught up to every officially localized canon entry in the series. I was quite surprised by how much I came to love Ys, since I almost always prefer my JRPGs to be turn-based. There are a few exceptions of individual action JRPGs that I end up really enjoying, but the only JRPG series with action-based combat that I have come to love as much as my favorites in the turn-based scene was Kingdom Hearts. But Ys managed to be another exception. It could be how the gameplay is fast and satisfying like Kingdom Hearts, or how the structure of the games and sense of adventure remind me more of The Legend of Zelda. I think it's a combination of both, plus every game in the series taking place in one of the most interesting worlds you'll find in the gaming landscape, that comes together to make Ys one of my favorite game series. For those curious, here's the order I played the games in, and my top 3 entries in ascending order is Ys 6, The Ark of Napishtim, Ys 7, and Ys 8, Lacrimosa of Dana. These entries stand out to me for having an enjoyable amount of gameplay variety, while also being some of Ys protagonist Adol Kristen's most compelling adventures from a narrative perspective. That's not to say the other Ys games don't succeed in one or both of these departments, but for me, Ys 6, 7, and 8 do the best job at balancing both, which is why they're my top 3. Or I should say they were my top 3, because after playing the recently released Ys 9 Monstrum Nox, I found not only a new favorite in the Ys series, but one of my favorite games I've played from Falcom to date. For those unfamiliar with Ys, the series follows the adventures of Adol Kristen and his traveling companion Dogi. Each game finds Adol and Dogi arriving at a new location where shenanigans ensue and they end up on a new adventure. There are some games that deviate from the formula, like how Ys 2 is a direct follow-up to the events of Ys 1, or Ys Origin telling a story from 700 years before Adol's journey with a different set of protagonists, but for the most part, Ys games follow this familiar setup. Ys 9 sees Adol and Dogi arrive in the city of Balduq, a city known for its huge prison and is totally not the Ys equivalent of Paris. Trust me. Once there, Adol is swiftly arrested, and shortly after, he escapes, because of course he does. During his escape, he meets a hooded woman who shoots him with some magic bullet, turning him into a monstrum. As one of the monstrum, Adol is now tasked with fending off the Grimwald Nox, while he investigates the curse affecting him and his fellow monstrums. An interesting premise to be sure, but I'll put a pin in the story for now so I can go into Ys 9's gameplay first. Those who have played Ys 8 will likely find a lot of Ys 9's gameplay to be similar. But for those who are not so familiar, Ys 9, much like its predecessor, is a party-based action JRPG where you play as Adol and his monstrum companions to explore the city of Balduq and the surrounding areas to fight off monsters and progress the story. In combat, each character's attacks are classified as one of 3 types: Slash, Pierce, and Strike, with each character having a basic 1-button combo and skills that each character unlocks as you play them. This party-based combat system was first introduced back in Ys 7, was refined in Memories of Celceta, and brought to near perfection in Ys 8, so it's not surprising that Ys 9 didn't try to reinvent the wheel in this department. That's not to say Ys 9's combat is completely identical to 8. I would probably say the biggest change is retooling how the extra skills work. In past party-based Ys titles, the extra skills were basically super moves your characters could perform once you filled a meter. In Ys 9, they changed this up by bringing back boost mode from Oath and Felghana and Origin. Much like in those games, when you fill up the gauge and activate boost mode, your character's stats will increase for a limited time. Just now in Ys 9, at any point during your boosted state, you can use the button combination again to use your extra skill, which will end boost mode once performed. I really like this change, as it not only brings back a fun mechanic from past games, but combining it with the extra skills like this makes both mechanics feel more complete, for lack of a better word. It'll feel a bit weird going back to a past game with either just boost mode or just the extra skills after playing Ys 9. Another nice combat element that is an improvement over Ys 8 is the damage type talismans. These accessories allow you to change a party member's attack type so you aren't locked to their original proficiency. These were technically also in Ys 8, but they've been made available much earlier in 9, which is a welcome change for those who, like me, want to use an attacker of each type in the party to cover all enemy weaknesses, while still having the freedom to use whoever I want. In another case of like Ys 8 but better, we have the missions in the Grimwald Nox. These are like the beast raids from Ys 8, but with an added variety of objectives and participation from all the monstrums, rather than just your main party of 3. I really enjoyed the raids in Ys 8, and Ys 9's improvements are much appreciated. One last addition that affects the combat in a pretty major way is the Monstrum's gifts, but those arguably add much more to Ys 9's sense of exploration, so I'll use this as a transition to start talking about that. Exploration has been an element of the Ys series since the very beginning, however, its importance tended to fluctuate in the earlier entries. But ever since Memories of Celceta, exploration has had a much more prominent and tangible role in the series. In that game, Adol's task of making a map of the Great Forest of Celceta led to a new system where exploration was much easier to keep track of and would even lead to rewards for the player. Ys 8 kept this concept largely the same, only really ironing out some of the bugs on a technical level. Ys 8 did add a much greater sense of verticality with the reintroduction of the jump mechanic, which, when combined with the map-making elements, made exploring the Isle of Siren a real treat. Thankfully, all of these elements return in Ys 9. Where Ys 9 really adds to the sense of exploration is the Monstrum gifts. These are abilities you obtain as you gain new party members that allow you to do things like run up walls, glide, and even sink into the ground. These gifts turn Belduc from a large and restrictive city into your own urban playground that is exhilarating to just run around in, and filled with so many little secrets to find. And I won't even get started on how much fun this makes the dungeons, or I'd be here all day. Another great aspect of Ys 9 is that from the moment Adol becomes a Monstrum, you have access to the double jump. This may seem like a small change, and to be fair, it kind of is, but for me, this is a huge improvement from Ys 8, where it felt like it took forever to get the double jump compared to previous entries with this mechanic. All these new and improved features come together to give Ys 9 the most satisfying sense of exploration I've ever experienced in a video game. These changes do come with an unintentional new layer of comedy though. The first is that the Monstrum gifts can sometimes expose some of Falcom's signature jank in certain areas, and can lead to some pretty funny animations when you switch to a party member who was previously using a gift. The second is that despite having orders to apprehend the Monstrums, the Hieroglyph Knights have absolutely no reaction to the main party turning into Monstrums right in front of their eyes while exploring, even though there are voice lines for the citizens of Belduc seeing the Monstrums. This is by no means a major issue, and I'm more than willing to suspend my disbelief for the sake of fun exploration. It's just kind of hilarious to me. But with that, I think I've gushed enough about Ys 9's gameplay, so let's move on to the presentation. Ys 9's presentation is probably where I have the most issues with the game, but even then I still quite enjoy it. I'll start with the graphics. Falcom has never really been a graphical powerhouse. That said, Ys 8 was actually quite a graphically impressive game for the Vita, but I can't quite say the same for Ys 9 on PS4. It looks very similar to Trails of Cold Steel 3 and 4, which were Falcom's first two games originally made for the PS4, Ys 9 being the third. Ys 9's biggest graphical improvement over Ys 8 is in the character models, which were given more realistic proportions and just look all around nicer. I think the models get a major assist from some of the best character designs you'll find in a Falcom game. I mean, look at these gothic icons. The environments seem to be a bit more hit or miss for some people. I can certainly understand why, as I also usually prefer a lot more color in my game worlds, but for me, Ys 9's more drab aesthetic works both in how it contrasts with the models for the main characters, and how that ties greatly into the game's overall narrative themes, which I won't say much more on for the obvious spoiler reasons. The cutscenes for this game are kind of all over the place. This is technically the first Falcom game to use motion capture technology, and if, like me, you've played a lot of Falcom's newer games, you'll immediately notice it, because those cutscenes actually look good. I love that these scenes are in the game, as it gives Ys 9 a much more cinematic feel when they're used. But this also sheds an even greater spotlight on the cutscenes that look a lot more familiar to modern Falcom fans with their less than stellar animations, and that's if the scene's anything more than just the character standing around talking to begin with. This juxtaposition can be very jarring at points, but I'm still glad the motion capture scenes are here, and it seems like Falcom was too, as it looks like they're continuing it for the 10th Trails game, which came out in Japan last year. So while I would say I enjoy Ys 9's graphics, I'm still quite glad that there's only going to be one more Falcom game for Western fans that looks like this, before Falcom starts using their new engine with this year's Japanese release, which, by the way, quick side tangent, I'm really liking the look of so far, and I can't wait to see how an Ys game looks in this engine. Back to Ys 9, and while the graphics are nice, I can't quite say the same for the performance, at least on base PS4. The frame rate is pretty solid in most of the dungeons and in the field areas surrounding Belduc, but in the city itself it can definitely be inconsistent. I heard the frame rate was much worse when Ys 9 first launched in Japan back in 2019, but over time it was improved through updates. So I'm glad Falcom could fix some of the issues, it's just a shame they couldn't get the performance consistent throughout the game. It's particularly bad in Balduke's agriculture district, and most of the times you fight enemies in the city. Also, apparently Ys 9 runs worse on PS4 Pro than it does on base PS4. I've heard similar issues with Trails of Cold Steel 3, so it seems like a consistent problem for Falcom, despite how little sense that actually makes. Luckily, this issue becomes practically non-existent on PS5, where I've heard the game runs at a much more consistent 60 frames per second, and it'll likely be a similar story for most modern PCs once it hits Steam. Falcom even recently updated the Japanese version of Ys 9 to support 4K on PS5, and I would be surprised if NIS America didn't get that update out for the Western release soon. All of these enhancements on PS5 are nice, and I'm sure the Steam release will have similar benefits, but it really would have been better to have a more consistent performance in how the game plays on both PS4 models, as it's my biggest problem with the game as it stands. Graphics aren't everything when it comes to a game's presentation though. I know for me personally, sound is actually much more important. The first aspect of Ys 9's sound design I want to talk about is the voice acting. Unsurprisingly, the English dub for Ys 9 is fantastic across the board, much as it was in Ys 8. Bryce Papenbrook and Patrick Seitz are once again great as Adol and Dogi respectively. Adol's Monstrum friends are voiced by Cristina Valenzuela, Damon Mills, Erica Mendez, Griffith Burns, and Erica Harlacher, who are all excellent as their respective characters. Another character I'd like to give a shout out to is Shantae, the Dandelion's fabulous bartender, played by Brandon McInnes. I wanted to shout out Shantae specifically because 1, it's just a great performance.
Soon after, it becomes a fluffy cloud of little seeds that float into the wind on a new journey. You, my dear Adol, are a dandelion, and that's what this bar shall be called.
But 2, because Shantae is such a breath of fresh air after Falcom has completely dropped the ball with LGBT+ representation in the past. This time around, it seems like the writers at Falcom took a class from the Silvando School of Queer Representation, which was desperately needed, and Shantae is all the better for it. After that quick little side tangent, that I really couldn't find a better place for, I would say the biggest standout performance for me has to be Aprilis, who is voiced by Don M. Bennett. I won't say more, as it's hard to talk about Aprilis without diving into spoilers, yeah, this game has some fantastic voice acting, y'all.
There is no going back now, I'm afraid. The wheels of fate are already turning. Use your power to escape this place. We will meet again, in time. Owen, my name is Aprilis.
One minor issue I have with the voice acting in this game stems from Ys 9 having significantly more cutscenes than previous entries. On one hand, this is nice, as there's more voice acting, bringing Ys 9 a lot closer to Trails in terms of the amount of voice dialogue. The downside to this though is it does give Ys 9 a problem that's prevalent in the Trails games, which is the inconsistent use of voice acting. There will sometimes be scenes where only a couple lines from one character are voiced, and it's very jarring, especially when you enjoy the voice acting in this game as much as I do.
Spirits. I must find a way to repay you.
Thank you.
Thankfully, the problem isn't as egregious here as it is in Trails, but it can still be jarring. Luckily, it seems the vocal performances in this game weren't affected by the inconsistent recording quality or sound mixing, which did somewhat hamper Trails of Cold Steel 4's otherwise fantastic dub when NIS America released that game back in October, so that's nice. This could be the result of the English voice acting for Trails and Ys being recorded at different studios, or the studios becoming more accustomed to restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic, but either way, it's greatly appreciated. Also, for those of you who prefer Japanese voice acting, that's also an option in the game's settings, so that gets another thumbs up from me. The last and for me most important aspect of Ys 9's presentation to talk about is the soundtrack. Falcom's soundtracks have arguably been just as, if not more famous than the games they make for almost as long as the company has existed, and Ys in particular has a long legacy of phenomenal tunes. For me, I knew the music in this series was something special from the moment I booted up the Chronicles release of the original game, and I was greeted to one of the most memorable title themes I've ever heard in a video game. and this sentiment was only reinforced when Adol left the first town to take his first steps on his new adventure. And the series only continued to impress as I kept playing the games, with my personal favorite soundtracks being from Ys 6 and Ys 8. Ys 8's soundtrack in particular is incredible, and I would say it's my second favorite soundtrack I've heard from Falcom, and I definitely put it up there among some of the best in gaming. With all that said, how does Ys 9's soundtrack fit into all of this? Well, I'll start off by saying it's definitely not a new favorite in the series for me. There are absolutely some standout tracks from the game that could easily stand with the series' best, but the overall soundtrack isn't quite as strong. That said, I do not agree with a few people I've seen on the internet who claim Ys 9 has the worst soundtrack in the series. Nah man, the soundtrack's still great. I think the main reason Ys 9's soundtrack isn't overall quite as fantastic as some of the previous games for me is how my favorite of Falcom's current composers, Yukihiro Jindo and Takehiro Unisuga, seem to have far less tracks in Ys 9 compared to past entries. I say seem because Falcom hasn't properly credited the composers for Ys 9's soundtrack, so fans are mostly left to guess who composed each track, especially for Falcom's in-house composers like Unisuga. Fortunately, both Jindo and Unisuga have a long history of composing Falcom music, and both have very recognizable styles that makes their tracks easier to distinguish. Also, as a freelancer who is commissioned by Falcom, Jindo has more freedom to discuss his involvement in Falcom's soundtracks, which helps to identify some of his songs as well. But taking all these factors into consideration, while not totally confirmed, it's fairly easy to see how few tracks Jindo and Unisuga have in Ys 9's soundtrack, which is a real shame. That's not to say the other two composers on Ys 9's soundtrack that we know of, Hayata Sonoda and Mitsuo Singa, aren't good composers. In fact, I think Sonoda is one of the more underappreciated Falcom composers. It's just that, for me, Jindo and Unisuga are some of my favorite composers around, and they both add so much to Falcom's OSTs with their compositions. On screen now, I'll show a few of both composers' contributions to Falcom's 3 most recent games leading up to Ys 9. All of these examples, which mind you are just their recent works, really highlight both composers' unique sounds and likely show how they came to be my favorite of Falcom's current lineup, and why their reduced role in Ys 9's OST was noticeable to me. Another major issue is that a lot of Ys 9's music kind of blends together for me. For example, the different songs that play in the Grimwald Nox all sound very similar, which makes a lot of those tracks just very forgettable. But luckily, there are some great tracks that aren't composed by Jindo and Unisuga that I adore, such as Marionette Marionette, Tranquil Silence, and Eyes On. And yes, for those familiar with their Ys music, Eyes On does indeed contain a nice motif from Fina, the aforementioned title theme for Ys 1, which is a nice touch. As for Jindo and Unisuga, they once again knock it out of the park, composing some of my favorite tracks in the series. Some examples of Unisuga's include Monstrum Spectrum, an excellent boss theme, and In Profile on Belfry, which is my favorite song to explore Belduke to. As for Jindo, Cloaca Maxima makes the first major dungeon of the game one of the best sewer levels in an RPG, and Gleesing Way? However the heck you pronounce that is easily my favorite track in the entire game. So while I wouldn't call Ys 9's soundtrack a personal favorite overall, it has some absolutely stellar tracks that really elevate the experience. So, now that I'm done talking your ear off about music, it's time to discuss the elements of Ys 9 that really elevate it from what on the surface seems like a retread of Ys 8 to one of my favorite games I've played from Falcom. These elements I'm referring to are of course the story and characters of Ys 9. But before I start talking about that, I need to take a quick detour to discuss NIS America's localization of Ys 9. This is important to address, as many Ys fans might be concerned about it after the, less than ideal state of Ys 8's original localization from NISA. I'm happy to report that Ys 9's English script is a massive improvement over Ys 8's original localization. I would even say it's an improvement over Ys 8's revised script from a few months after launch. This isn't super surprising to me, since NIS America has made Falcom's games a bigger priority after what happened with Ys 8. Trails of Cold Steel 3 and 4's localizations, while not perfect, both launched in a much better state than Ys 8, and Ys 9 might be NISA's best Falcom localization yet. With all of that being said, let's get back to talking about Ys 9's story. Now, storytelling has always had a role in the Ys series, but it has become more of a focus and has improved as the series has progressed, with one major exception, but I digress. I remember the ending of Ys 7 hitting me emotionally way more than I ever thought it would, and Ys 8, at the time, told the most compelling story you'd find in the series. That said, there was still definitely room for improvement. Falcom games tend to be very backloaded in their storytelling, and that's something that really started to become noticeable in the Ys series as the games started to get longer. As I said before, at the time, Ys 8 told the most compelling story in the series, but pretty much all of that intrigue didn't really amount to much until the 5th chapter, which is quite far into the game. While I wouldn't say Ys 9 completely fixes this problem, it has a workaround that in my opinion makes the early game much more interesting from a narrative perspective. With Ys 9, the writers at Falcom decided to spend the early and middle chapters exploring our main cast of monstrums, while sprinkling in their usual overarching plot setup. This seemingly minor change added so much for me, as strong characterization is one of my favorite aspects of story-driven games, and it's something Ys had only really dabbled in before now. It's not just the monstrums who benefit from this character-focused approach, as the various allies you recruit for the Dandelion Bar over the course of the game are also engaging characters in their own right. Something else that I think really helps the early game is Ys 9's excellent side quests. Almost every side quest in this game serves to add either to the story, the world, or the characters, and it makes most of the side quests an absolute treat. All of these aspects really come together to make the story of the game even more impactful, because oh boy, once this game's story gets going, it goes places I truly never expected. I wouldn't dare spoil you because, oh my god, it's too good. One thing I will say is that as a fan of the series who has played most of the games, I really appreciate the various ways this game managed to tie in Adolf's past adventures into the narrative, in a way that feels both organic and rewarding, while also keeping the main plot mostly accessible for newcomers. Very reminiscent of Ys 6 in that regard, now that I think about it. One other part of the game that adds a lot to the story for me is the setting of Balduq. The Ys series is full of games that largely take place in more natural environments, and Ys 9 itself also has some of those traditional looking locales, but for the most part, the game takes place in the massive city of Balduq, which is such a different setting for the series and in my opinion is incredibly refreshing. Especially so after Ys 8 felt like a rehash of Ys 6 in the setting department. The setting is not that game's strongest aspect in my opinion. But back to Balduq, it also helps that it's brilliantly realized in its design in the game, and wonderfully ties in with the themes of Ys 9's narrative. But I'm going to stop there, as it's hard to say much more about the story, characters, and settings without delving into spoiler territory, so I think it's about time to start wrapping this video up. If I hadn't made it obvious enough in everything I've said up until now, I love Ys 9, and while I have some minor issues with it in the presentation department, the fantastic gameplay and phenomenal storytelling bring it all together to be a wonderful experience. While I do have quite a few games from Falcom's back catalog I would still like to play, I feel confident in saying that Ys 9 is my second favorite game from them, just behind The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky second chapter, and much like that game, I would consider Ys 9 Monstrum Nox to be one of my favorite games I've ever played. I'm incredibly excited for the future of Falcom's games and how the East series will fit into that. Falcom president Toshihiro Kondo recently confirmed that the next East game will be East 10. Rip to my fellow fans who hoped for an East 5 remake a la Oath and Felghana and Memories of Celceta. I'm hoping maybe we'll still get that at some point. Either way, I can't wait to see East 10 when Falcom is ready to show it off. With all that being said, I've been Casual and I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts on East 9 in the comments if you've played it, and if not, maybe this video piqued your interest in it? If you want to know when more videos from me release, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Either way, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see y'all next time.